Hello campers and welcome to W.O.L.F Camp, Wildlife Outdoor Leadership Focus. Thank you for clicking on the Welcome Guide to Key Concepts. In this optional video, this will give you the things you need to know before we go on our adventure. And this is an optional video. These are for the ones that are aspiring to be wildlife biologists that want to learn more behind the scenes and learn the practices and science behind what we do as conservationists and wildlife managers. So let's dive in. First, let's talk about ecoregions. Ecoregions are areas of the country that can be separated into groupings. Those groupings are ecoregions. These areas have similar climate, vegetation, and wildlife. As you can see, there are several ecoregions in the United States. In the southeast, we have the Southeast Mixed and Outer Coastal Plain Forest. That's the one that we'll be taking a close look at. That is our footprint. But please don't be discouraged or sad if you are not in this area. If you're viewing us from outside the state, around the country, we'll be talking about many wildlife species and vegetation types that can be found in your particular ecoregion. For example, I grew up in the eastern deciduous forest before moving here and becoming a 4-H agent for the University of Florida IFAS, and I see many of the same trees, plants, and wildlife that I've seen back home. So, let's take a look. We said we were going to focus on the Southeast Mixed and Outer Coastal Plain Forest. You'll hear me refer to it as the Southeast Ecoregion, and it is highlighted in blue here. In this area, this terrain, the countryside, is rolling hills to mostly flat, spaced with marshes, lakes, and swamps, and there are numerous along the coastal plain. The average annual precipitation ranges from 40 to 60 inches. Precipitation is received throughout the year, and summers are hot and winters are mild. The dominant plant life or vegetation that you'll see depends on the succession stage, and we'll define that later on, but succession means a community of different vegetation types. You can find trees such as oaks, hickories, American beech, black gum, red maple, magnolia, laurel oaks, on many upland sites, especially where prescribed fire is used. You can see pine species such as longleaf and loblolly, and they can be in the principal overstory, which means dominant overstory, especially if fire is being used. Unfortunately, the lack of fire has decimated the longleaf pine species in this area, and most of it has been planted in loblolly pine. But without select thinning and fire, the loblolly has low value for wildlife. You can also find gum, cypress on the moist areas along the Atlantic and Gulf coasts, especially around river drainages. I said that we were focusing on the Southeast Mixed and Coastal Plain Forest, but we also have to consider some other ecoregions. And those ecoregions are urban. The urban ecoregion is everywhere. We have a lot of folks that like to live in cities and near subdivisions, urban areas, and we have to share that space with animals. Some of those animals are the American robin, house finch, house sparrow, raccoon, eastern gray squirrel, and white-tailed deer. Those can also be found in our southeast forest, but you'll see barred owl, mourning dove, northern bobwhite, coyote, fox squirrel, wild pig, and all these ecosystems that we're talking about. Dominant vegetation in the urban landscape is hard to identify because commonly in urban areas we find gravel and paved areas, annual plantings, perennial grasses, and forbs, shrubs, and young mature trees. A forb is a plant that is not woody, which has a stem like a tree, and it's not a grass, so it's in between. It is a flowering plant that animals often browse or use as cover. We also must consider the wetland ecosystem. Wetlands can be described as the zone between deep water and upland areas. They are characterized by various amounts of open water and vegetation with a soil that is often wet or covered with shallow water. We have many of those in Florida. And we have wildlife species that are obligated, which means they have to have that type of ecoregion. Some of those that you may be familiar with is something near and dear in our hearts, the American alligator. We have the golden cheek warbler. We have red-tailed hawks that fly over. And we also have the American bullfrog, my favorite amphibian. So we'll be taking a look at closer wildlife species. Vegetation types for the wetlands include willow oaks, cattails, and other aquatic vegetation. So if you remember previously, I talked about succession, those plant communities. Well, what does that look like? Let me help you explain succession so you can have success at identifying these stages of vegetative communities. So here I want you to think of succession as a timeline, beginning from the beginning of time to the future. If you look there on the bottom, you have time starting out at disturbed soil. So, for example, if we have a fire and it burned away all the vegetation, you have bare soil. So disturbed soil would be a succession stage of 1. Then if another storm or another fire doesn't come, we start seeing annual grasses and forbs start to come up. That annual means that it completes its life cycle in 1 year. It grows, it flowers, it seeds, and it dies. Where perennial sticks around. That is succession stage number 2. And then we start seeing more of a different vegetative community. We start seeing perennial grasses, forbs, and brambles, which is a fancy way of saying blackberries, followed by shrubs, and eventually trees. And then you see trees dominated by species that are not shade tolerant, which means they have to have full sun, and eventually they will shade each other out. And trees that will be dominated by species that can handle that tolerant. In Florida, and most of the southeast ecoregion, that dominant succession stage will be an oak hickory to an American beech red maple forest. So a very thick forest. Starts out and then it grows, closes the canopy, which doesn't allow sunlight to hit the forest floor. So basically, plant succession represents the change in composition of a plant community in a particular area over time. Climate, soils, and disturbance events determine which type of plant species, and therefore vegetation types are found on a particular site. Those disturbances may be fire, wind, ice storms, flooding, or, as we'll later talk about, something that we do to manage for wildlife species. Depending on climate in a particular ecoregion, may be several, only a few successional stages. You don't have to have as many stages as we have on this timeline. And it's very site specific. For example, here in Florida, it could be the beech and maple forest, or on a sand dune, that final stage could be really tall grass or sea oats. What's very important to remember here, as vegetation structure and forage availability change, the species of wildlife that use that area change because different wildlife species have different habitat requirements. And we'll talk a little bit about that. For example, you have some species that can live its entire life in one successional stage. For example, our friend, the eastern gray squirrel. It can spend its entire life in an oak hickory forest. Whereas a white-tailed deer, one highly sought-after big game species in North America, live in almost every type of successional stage. If you look there on the top, black bear, coyote, box turtle, white-tailed deer, wild turkey, they all hang out in a variety of different vegetative types. So when we manage wildlife, we have to pick that succession stage or stages that particular individual wants. So if we manage for white-tailed deer, which is done a lot, we manage for a diversity of vegetative communities. And when we manage for white-tailed deer, that may be our focus, but look at all the other wildlife that we are helping. We are helping black bear, coyote, box turtles, great horned owls. All these songbirds benefit from white-tailed deer management. However, we have some wildlife species that really depend on that particular succession stage. For example, if we are managing for mourning dove, we would not do so in this oak hickory forest here on the right side of the graph. We would have to stick to much earlier succession types. So if we have a pine stand or a hardwood stand, we would have to do some habitat management practices to set back succession. So it's very important to know what kind of vegetative types we have and what that particular species of wildlife need. So what does plant succession look like in the southeast ecoregion? Well, let's take a look. The first stage of plant succession is annual forbs and grasses. That's dominated in the first successional stage. Here you see a strip that was disked in a field dominated by perennial native warm season grasses. The wildlife biologists did that to enhance brooding cover, which means nesting, taking care of young for northern bobwhite quail. If you look closely, you can see some ragweed and bare ground in the disc strip as compared to the relatively dense native grass on the right. That first stage gives way to the second stage, and that's where we start seeing more diversity. We start seeing perennial forbs and grasses that slowly give way to the third. We see a little more woody stems. We start to see shrubs, some trees, some sweet gum, red maple, eastern red cedar. This transition provides excellent cover for many wildlife species. And various shrubs and trees represent the third successional stage. You'll also see planted loblolly pine stands, often represented in this stage. Longleaf pine also represents in this stage, but is maintained with frequent prescribed fire, which prohibits the next succession stage. The final one here in Florida, in the southeast ecoregion, is mature hardwoods. So you'll start seeing American beech, red maple, oak hickory mix. But look at how clear it is under the forest floor there. The canopy closes. It does not allow sunlight to hit the forest floor. So you do not have much vertical structure, and we'll get into that later. Very open. This is not ideal for many species of wildlife. Imagine being a baby cottontail rabbit or a baby deer, a fawn, and trying to hide from a predator. A predator can see you very easily. It would be hard to make a living here in this stage. Some wildlife really prefer this closed canopy system. Many of our songbirds enjoy this system. But that's why it's important to be specific on what we're trying to manage for. So speaking of different succession types and managing for species, let's talk about habitat and habitat requirements. Habitat represents the physical and biological resources needed for that particular wildlife species for survival. And that's just like us. We need the same type of things. We need food, cover, water, and space. Habitat requirements are species specific. That means not all species require the same resources in the same amount of time. If those resources or requirements are provided in a particular area, then that area represents habitat for the species. You will hear a lot of professionals, including myself, use the term as suitable habitat. Well, that is not correct. It is either habitat or it is not. Habitat quality may range from excellent to poor depending on resources availability, but the minimum habitat requirements for a given species are not provided, then the area is not considered habitat for that species. It should not be confused with vegetation or vegetation types. Habitat incorporates a lot more than just vegetation. Some wildlife species may find all their habitat requirements in one vegetation type. Others require a lot of different vegetation types. Sometimes habitat type and vegetation type is used interchangeably, but that can be confusing and we should avoid it. When we're trying to manage for a particular wildlife species, we try to incorporate species richness and diversity. So a lot of times when you have a focal or a wildlife species of interest, such as white-tailed deer, we manage for that animal, but also we incorporate practices and techniques that benefit a whole lot of other animals. By doing so, we try to make sure that the vegetation types are interchangeable, interspersed in the right vertical and correct arrangement. So a lot of different diversity vegetation types to achieve that species diversity. One thing that we must consider in trying to manage for wildlife is check for non-native and invasive species. These invasive species and animals contribute to the loss of habitat for native wildlife and fish species. Non-native invasive wildlife and fish often outcompete native wildlife and fish because population declines of native species. Non-native species, both plants and animals, pose a considerable challenge for natural resource managers, and most are very difficult to control or eradicate. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't try. Common non-native and invasive species include the wild pig and the air potato as far as a plant. Every effort should be made to prevent the introduction of non-native species that may become invasive. So after we know what particular wildlife that we're trying to manage for and what vegetation types that specific species requires, and after trying to eradicate and identify non-native plants and animals, we need to look how the habitat is arranged. So we're going to look at arrangement. That first fancy word there is a $10 word. That juxtaposition simply means how different successional stages or vegetation types are situated in relation to others. That is horizontal management. Some wildlife species may attain all their habitat requirements from one vegetation type, such as our friend the eastern gray squirrel, while other species greatly benefit from more than one, as we mentioned in our white-tailed deer. If we're managing for multiple vegetation types, the juxtaposition can be very important. For example, we can use edge. Edge is where two vegetation types meet. Where you have a field going into a nicely mowed pasture is what we call hard edge. That is less beneficial. Wildlife tend to be skittish and won't utilize that as much as if you do what we call feathered edge. Feathered edge transitions those two vegetation communities gradually over time and over space. Juxtaposition is important too because you don't want to create islands. You don't want to have wildlife on islands. For example, if you had one strip of nicely vegetated type for the cottontail rabbit and you were a hungry coyote or a hungry red-tailed hawk, you know that those cottontail rabbits will be hanging out loafing in that edge. So what you've done is created a corridor where they can be slammed by predators. So don't place your wildlife on an island. Space and arrangement can be very important. Also consider vertical structure. You remember the photo where it had a closed canopy. I said that it would be hard to be a baby deer, a fawn making a living there. You could be picked off by predators. Vertical structure can be very important. Many songbirds benefit from this vertical structure. There are distinct layers of vegetation within that. The understory composed of plants growing near the ground up to 4.5 feet tall, and the understory may be diverse, include grasses, forbs, sedges, brambles, and shrubs. The midstory is represented primarily of shrubs. These different layers can be home to many different species of wildlife, even sparsed out between those layers. What's going to be really fun this week is at the end of this camp, I'm going to give you a blank sheet that you see here of all the wildlife species that we talked about. These are just a handful of them here on the list. And we're going to put this into practice. We're going to show you a site, and you're actually going to get to manage it. You're going to write a wildlife management plan. For example, we're going to give you 3 species. We'll say manage for white-tailed deer, Prothonotary warbler, which is a very beautiful bird that we'll talk about this week, and wild turkey. And we'll show you this site, and you're going to have to determine that it has the proper vegetative communities, succession stage, habitat requirements for those 3 species. Well, as we know, no site is perfect. So what do we do if the site is not perfect? Well, we have tools. We start to use the art and science of wildlife management. We have these tools called habitat management practices. And those practices are listed there in the left column. Those are things that we can do to provide that requirement for that particular species. For example, the first one there is a conservation easement. If you do not know what a conservation easement is, it is actually a legal agreement that permanently limits the use of the land in order to protect and conservation efforts. So if you're on land and you never want it to be developed into a shopping mall, there's practices that you can do legally to make sure that that never happens. As you can see, there are a couple of wildlife species that benefit from that. So if that is a possibility, you can do that for loggerhead shrike, eastern indigo snake, and gopher tortoise. So, for example, if we give you white-tailed deer, and it is in an open field with no hardwoods whatsoever, you would probably need to plant some native grasses and forbs, plant some trees, and plant some shrubs. If we take you to a site that has a nice forest, has good vertical structure, you would not need to select those things because it's already there. Or you wouldn't need to set back succession if it's the proper stages. Now, if we're managing for mourning dove and we're standing in an oak hickory hardwood forest, we would have to select that box that says set back succession. What you see in front of you is the best case scenario. That is a blank canvas of land there that you have. Of all species, we conduct a wildlife and fish survey. We need to know what is there, and that's some really cool practices. You can use game cameras and bait to catch the animals on camera. It's a really fun way to see what you have on the property. But look these definitions up, habitat management practices, And if you have a question, ask your 4-H agent about what these terms mean. And again, it's all by your judgment. For like the ones that says water developments for wildlife, you see that there's only a couple wildlife species selected. Well, you know, it's they're like us. They need water to survive. We have to drink water. Well, some wildlife get enough water from the diet that they eat, so water developments would not be necessary. But if you go on the property and you do not see any water for the wildlife to drink, no creeks, ponds, lakes, if we are managing for wood duck, then obviously we would have to put in some water development structures, not only for it to drink, but for habitat requirement to make that animal happy. But then again, if you do see water on the property, don't select it because it's already there. I look forward to seeing wildlife management plans. This is great practice. This is what the pros do. And don't fret. I'll give you a study guide here and a blank one, and we'll go to a site and we'll have some fun. You'll be managing wildlife in no time. So now that we've learned a little bit about the key concepts and terms, thank you for watching this. That shows me that you want to go above and beyond to actually learn the science behind it. Let's start our adventure. On to the hunt. I look forward to hearing from you all the rest of the week. Please make sure that you check out the days. The camp is numbered: day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4. You may pick and choose your activities, and they will be more hands-on and more interactive as they go. Thank you, and have a great week at W.O.L.F Camp.